So a new airport for Western Sydney and a $3 billion infrastructure package to help get passengers to it. I'm joined by Simon Cowan from the Centre for Independent Studies to see if the business case makes sense. Simon, is there a business case for this airport and for the investment to go to it?
Well, I think in the longer term there certainly is. One thing that has become increasingly apparent is that while Sydney Airport is reaching capacity now, in 15 or 20 years' time, it won't have the slots available for the sort of traffic that they're looking at bringing in there. So there's a need to start planning for additional infrastructure, additional airports in Sydney to meet consumer demand. When you decide to put an airport into a city, particularly somewhere like Badgerys Creek, which is not currently well serviced by sort of the high volume roads, there's a need for additional infrastructure to go in there. And so while I think there needs to be more work done around the specific costs and benefits of the infrastructure package, I think in broad terms the business case adds up.
Is $3 billion enough to do that?
It's hard to say, but it's worth noting that the existing New South Wales long-term master transport plan doesn't make allowance for the second airport and building the infrastructure necessary for it. It's also worth noting that the $3.5 billion package over 10 years announced today doesn't include rail links to the airport, which will be a very necessary step for moving volumes of passengers in and out. So I think it's likely that that $3.5 billion will need to be increased over time. It's important that, as we're seeing, for example, with the widening of the M5, that we build sufficient infrastructure when we can so we don't have to go back and try and retrofit it later.
Now, who's going to pay for this? Is it purely going to be a government spending project, or do you expect to see a lot more private money coming into it?
Well, I think, for a start, I understand that Sydney Airports Corporation has a right of first refusal over development of the airport. I think given the expectation for increased population in Western Sydney, the expectation for increased demand for air services in Western Sydney, there's likely to be a strong push for some, if not most of this money to be provided by the private sector. Even if it is a government-led project, then there's still a strong case, I think, for using private money for some of the infrastructure development around the airport. So I think, and the government, I understand, agrees with this, that they should be pushing for as much private sector funding as possible.
Now, finally, Simon, how important is this to the region of Western Sydney?
Well, I think it's very important. What we have seen from some of the planning work around Sydney Airport is that the expectation is in 15 years' time that they'll reach basically the capacity. They're close to capacity now in terms of their prime time slots. And we've got restrictions on Sydney Airport in terms of the curfew that are making Sydney Airport somewhat disadvantageous towards some of the airports in the region. So I think there's a lot of benefits to Western Sydney in particular in terms of access to air travel and shortening the time it takes to get to the airport, but also the ability to compete more effectively with Melbourne Airport and other airports without, say, potentially that curfew or some of the other restrictions that are currently on Sydney Airport.
Simon Cowan from the Centre for Independent Studies, thank you very much.
Thank you.